My name is Sarah Chen, and I was 52 years old when my dead husband saved my life from an airport terminal in Philadelphia. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds, because I've had months now to sit with it, to turn it over in my hands like a river stone, smooth and heavy and impossible to put down. And every time I think I've made peace with the enormity of what David did, every time I think I finally understand the full shape of the love he left behind, I find one more layer, one more corner he thought to protect, one more thing he prepared while he was dying that I had no idea about until it was the only thing standing between me and disaster. This is that story. Stories, I've come to think, rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with the grand music of beginnings. They creep in through the most unremarkable doors. A text message on a Tuesday, a stranger's number, an airport security line where nothing extraordinary had ever happened before, and nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen now. We're always in the middle of our most important moments before we recognize them for what they are, which is perhaps why they're able to take us so fully by surprise. I've told this story to a small number of people: my daughter Jessica, my son Marcus, two close friends from before everything changed, and eventually a grief counselor who spent our first 3 sessions gently insisting I was doing better than I thought. Each time I told it, I had the experience of watching someone's face change in the middle, a kind of recalibration happening in real time. Because the story I'm telling is not only a story about loss, and it's not only a story about betrayal, and it's not only a story about love so deep, it found a way to persist past the end of a body. It's all of those things at once, and it begins in the most ordinary way possible. It starts in a TSA line on a Tuesday morning in March, which is, if you think about it, an appropriately ordinary place for an extraordinary thing to begin. I had a carry-on that kept catching on the belt. I had a cortisol headache that had been sitting behind my left eye since 4 in the morning. I had a boarding pass for Air Canada flight AC 8847 to Vancouver, and I had 17 years of grief compressed into the past 6 weeks, which is when I'd learned my husband of 30 years was dying. 6 weeks of grief is not enough time to understand grief. 6 weeks is barely enough time to understand what day it is, what you're supposed to be eating, how it's possible that the ordinary world, the traffic and the grocery stores and the co-workers asking how you're doing with that particular expression of careful concern, continues to function as though nothing has been permanently altered. 6 weeks is when you're still waking up at 4 in the morning because the other half of the bed is wrong, because the absence has a physical weight, because your body knew him better than your conscious mind and has not yet been updated with the information. I had cleaned out his side of the medicine cabinet on day 3, because I read somewhere that you should do it quickly, and I had believed that advice before I understood what it actually meant. The particular cruelty of a Tuesday morning with a toothbrush that would never be used again, with the specific brand of shaving cream he'd bought in bulk from Costco, 6 cans still remaining, 6 cans for a man who didn't exist anymore. I'd put them in a paper bag and put the paper bag in the recycling bin, and then sat on the bathroom floor for 40 minutes while the light changed. I had attended the will reading. I had met with estate attorneys. I had learned what a probate timeline looked like and what the word contestable meant when applied to a document I thought had been settled and done. I had sat across a table from David's brother Thomas, who had looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something polished, something managed, something that had the structure of sympathy without its substance. And I had thought, I don't know this man. We've known each other for 26 years and I don't know him at all. 6 weeks. That was all the time I'd had to prepare. I was standing in that line, shuffling forward in my socks, doing what you do, looking at my phone not because I expected anything, but because it was somewhere to put my eyes. And that's when the text came in. Unknown number. That alone was enough to make my stomach tighten, because I was 52 and a certain generation, and unknown numbers meant either spam or bad news, and I'd had enough bad news in 6 weeks to last several lifetimes. I almost didn't open it. I almost kept shuffling forward. I want to reconstruct for you exactly why I opened it. Not because the reason is dramatic, but because it matters. Because it explains something about the particular state I was in those first 6 weeks. When you've had enough bad news, you develop a relationship with it. Not courage exactly, and not acceptance. Something more like the exhausted resignation of someone who has already survived the worst, and can therefore face whatever smaller disasters might still be coming. What is left to be afraid of? What news could arrive that would remake the world more thoroughly than it had already been remade? So I opened it. Not with hope, not with dread. With the particular flatness of someone who has decided that not knowing is somehow worse than knowing. I had made this decision many times over the previous 6 weeks, with estate documents, with medical bills, with the voicemails I had avoided for days before finally listening to them all in one sitting, in the dark, on the living room floor. I had learned to open things. I opened it. Don't board that flight. Trust me. 5 words. I read them once and felt nothing, because my brain refused to process them as real. I read them again and felt my heart do something strange and sideways. I read them a 3rd time, and by then I was standing completely still in the middle of the TSA line, and the woman behind me was making a sound of impatient exasperation that I could not have cared less about. The line had resumed moving around me. I was, briefly, an island. A woman standing still in a river of motion, bags and shoes and laptops and small children. The normal chaos of a security checkpoint on a Tuesday morning, and I was completely outside of all of it. Somewhere in my chest, a door had opened that I didn't have language for yet. I want to be precise about this, because what I felt in that moment was not fear and not certainty and not even hope. It was something more like recognition. The sensation of something clicking into place that I hadn't known was misaligned. Don't board that flight. 5 words. Trust me. I had not heard those 2 words, trust me, since the last time David had said them, which was in November, in his hospital room, when I'd asked if he was in pain and he'd looked me in the eyes and said no and then said it. Trust me. And I had believed him. Because I always believed him, because 30 years had given me no reason not to. My hands were cold. The line moved. I stood still. The number was unfamiliar. A 215 area code, local, but not a number I recognized. My first thought, my first desperate, irrational thought, was Marcus. My son. Marcus, who was 28 years old and had flown to San Francisco 3 days ago and should, at this exact moment, have been landing at SFO or already at his friend's apartment or nowhere near Philadelphia. I called him. Nothing. Voicemail on the first ring, which meant his phone was either dead or off. I called again. Voicemail. The gate was at the end of the terminal. The flight was boarding. The gate agent had already called my zone. I stood in that airport with my carry-on and my headache and 17 years of a particular kind of grief compressed into 6 weeks, and I thought about David, about his hospital bed in November, the particular quality of light in that room, the way his hands had looked against the white blanket, thin but still his hands, still the hands I'd held through 30 years of everything, about the way he'd looked at me when he said it. "You need to see Victoria Island in spring," he'd said. "Book it for March. Don't change the dates." I'd almost canceled the trip 3 times. Once, when the estate paperwork got complicated. Once when I simply couldn't imagine being happy anywhere. Once when Thomas, David's brother, had started making noises about the will. And the thought of leaving the country felt like abandoning a battlefield. But David had made me promise. And in 6 weeks of grief, keeping David's promises had become the only thing that felt solid. And through all of it, I had kept his instruction. The trip to Vancouver, the ferry to Victoria Island. March, he'd said. Don't change the dates. So I'd kept the booking. Vancouver first, then the ferry to Victoria Island, just like he'd wanted. And now an unknown number was telling me not to board. The gate agent's voice crackled through the speaker. Final boarding call for AC8847. Here is what you need to understand about that moment, and I need you to really sit with this, because everything that follows depends on you understanding what I was carrying when I made that decision. My husband had been dead for 6 weeks. His brother was contesting his will. His sister-in-law had looked me in the eyes at the funeral, at my husband's funeral, while I was still holding a crumpled tissue from weeping over his casket, and said something to me so cold, so precisely designed to cut, that I had replayed it in my mind approximately 400 times since then. I was exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't touch. I was alone in a way that crowds don't fix. I was standing in a TSA line in Philadelphia International Airport in my socks, and the only person in the world I would have trusted without question had been dead for 6 weeks. But Marcus never joked about serious things. Never. Not once in 28 years had my son used alarm as a punchline. Whatever this was, wrong number, misunderstanding, something I couldn't yet see, he'd texted me from somewhere I didn't know, about a flight I shouldn't take, and asked me to trust him. I didn't board. I want to explain that decision more fully than it can be explained in 3 words. Because from the outside, from the perspective of someone watching a woman step out of a TSA line over a text from an unknown number, it looks impulsive. It looks like exactly the kind of irrational behavior that grief produces. It looks like the decision of someone who is not entirely operating at full capacity, who is running on 4 hours of sleep and 6 weeks of loss, and is therefore susceptible to suggestion. And maybe all of that is true. Maybe I would have made a different decision if I'd been anyone else in any other circumstance. But grief, whatever else it does to you, strips away the distance between yourself and your instincts. It removes the layers of social calculation that usually govern how we act in public spaces. I didn't worry, in that moment, what the woman behind me thought. I didn't perform the internal debate that most people would have had. I simply understood, in the direct, wordless way that the body sometimes understands things before the mind catches up, that I was not going to board that plane. I stepped out of the line. I said excuse me to the woman behind me, on reflex, that particular brand of Midwestern politeness that survives even existential disruption. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and irritation. I collected my carry-on from the belt. I sat on a nearby bench and put my shoes back on. And I thought, David, in the way I had been thinking his name constantly for 6 weeks, not summoning him exactly, but using his name as a kind of compass point, finding my bearings by the direction of what I'd lost. David, what is this? The gate agent's voice crackled through. Final boarding call for AC8847. I didn't move. I stepped out of the line. I collected my bag from the belt. I put my shoes back on, and I walked to the nearest seating area and sat down very hard on a plastic chair and tried to call Marcus 14 more times. Nothing. 17 attempts total. Nothing. I want to tell you what it is to sit in an airport for 2 hours waiting for something you can't name. Not the drama of it. It wasn't dramatic from the outside, but the texture of it. The departure board was my fixed point. I watched my flight status change from boarding to departed in the particular way that final things happen. Suddenly, and then permanently. One moment it was a possibility. The next it was a fact of the past. Irrevocable. I bought a coffee I didn't drink. I walked to a window and watched a plane pull back from a gate. Not my plane, a different one. Going somewhere else, and thought about the fact that I had no idea where I was going. 3 hours ago, I'd known exactly where I was going. Now, I was a woman sitting in Philadelphia International Airport with a carry-on full of spring clothes packed for a trip that was not happening, and I had no plan, and no one to call, and nothing to do but wait and try to understand what was happening. I thought about the last time I'd been in this airport with David. 2 Christmases ago, flying to Portland to see his college roommate. He'd bought us both terrible airport sandwiches and eaten them without complaint, and then made a joke about the mustard that had made me laugh loud enough that people turned to look. I had thought at the time that this This ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday was my life, that the mundane joy of it was inexhaustible. I had been right, and I had been wrong, in equal measure. I sat in that airport for nearly 2 hours. I watched the departure board flip my flight from boarding to departed. I felt the particular shame of someone who has made a decision they cannot explain. The low-grade embarrassment of standing in the middle of an airport with nowhere to go, having skipped a flight because of a text from a number she didn't recognize. And then my phone lit up with an email from Marcus's real number, his actual number, the one I'd called 17 times. The subject line made my hands go cold. "Mom, I didn't send that text, but you need to read this." The attachment loaded slowly. It was a medical file. Pennsylvania Hospital letterhead, Department of Oncology, Dr. Patricia Way. The date at the top read 14 months ago. Patient, David Chen, 54. Date of consultation, January 14th. Diagnosis, Stage 4, pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Prognosis, 8 to 12 months without aggressive intervention, 12-18 with treatment. Patient aware of prognosis. Has declined to inform family until absolutely necessary. Patient states, "I have preparations to complete." I read it once. I read it again. The third time, the words stopped making individual sense and became something else. A sound, almost, like a note sustained too long. Like something breaking very slowly in a very quiet room. 14 months. He had known for 14 months. I had known for 6 weeks. I want you to sit with that arithmetic. 14 months. 57 weeks, give or take. While I was planning our 30th anniversary party, the guest list and the caterer and whether to do it at the house or rent a venue, David had been living with the knowledge that he would likely never see our 30th anniversary. While I was helping Jessica research bridal venues for a hypothetical wedding, worrying about whether outdoor ceremonies in Pennsylvania were too weather-dependent, David was calculating whether he would live long enough to see her get engaged. While I was complaining, actually complaining out loud to his face, about the commute on the Broad Street line and a difficult colleague and a parking situation on our street that had been bothering me for months, David was sitting with something that made every parking situation on every street in the world irrelevant. I sat with the phone in my hand and I thought about all the ordinary nights of those 14 months. The dinners, the evenings on the couch watching television, the Sunday mornings when he made coffee and brought mine to me in bed, which he had done every Sunday for 30 years without being asked, which I had accepted for 30 years without fully understanding what it meant, that every one of those Sundays he was choosing me. Choosing that small act of love over the enormous weight of everything he was carrying. In those 14 months, had he seemed different? Had I missed something? I turned that question over in Starbucks by Gate C, and I kept turning it for weeks afterward. The honest answer is yes and no, and it's more complicated than either. He had seemed more deliberate in retrospect, more present in certain moments, catching my eyes across a room with an expression I'd sometimes noticed and not quite known how to read. More likely to stop what he was doing when I walked into a room, to actually set things down and look at me. I had interpreted this as contentment, which is the interpretation you make when you're happy. I had thought, we have finally gotten to this place in our 50s where we are genuinely good at being together, unhurried, present. He was present because he was counting down. I sat in that Starbucks and the coffee got cold in front of me, and somewhere in my chest, something was reordering itself around a new understanding. David was not a man who had kept a secret from me. David was a man who had spent 14 months protecting me from a devastation he couldn't prevent, trying to manage the shape of my grief, trying to give me as much of our ordinary life as he could before ordinary life ended. He had been dying, and what he had done with that knowledge was keep making my coffee on Sunday mornings. While I was planning our 30th anniversary trip, while I was helping our daughter Jessica pick out wedding venues for an engagement that hadn't happened yet, while I was cheering at Marcus's graduate school orientation at Berkeley, David had been sitting with a death sentence for over a year, sitting with it at the dinner table, sitting with it in the car, in our bed, at every birthday and holiday and ordinary Tuesday evening we'd shared in those 14 months. Sitting with it and smiling at me and making plans and saying I love you every morning the way he always did, 2 times, once on each side of my face. What preparations, David? I was sitting in a Starbucks by Gate C when my phone rang. Unknown number. The same 215 area code as the text. I answered before I could think about it. Mrs. Chen? The voice was male, careful, professionally warm. This is Robert Kimura. I worked with your husband for the past 11 months. I apologize for the unusual contact, but David's instructions were very specific. You were not to board flight AC 8847 to Vancouver today. I needed to ensure you received that message. Who are you? I'm a private investigator based in Center City. Your husband retained me last April. There's a cafe on Walnut Street near Rittenhouse Square. Leone's. Can you be there in 40 minutes? I was there in 35. I don't know what I expected when I walked into that cafe. Some part of me was still operating in the mode I'd been in all morning. Reactive, present tense, simply responding to the next thing without any larger framework, yet for what it all meant. Another part of me was conducting the internal argument that had been running since I'd stepped out of the TSA line. What are you doing, Sarah? You missed a flight because of a text from an unknown number. You are standing in a coffee shop in Center City, waiting to meet a stranger who claims to have worked for your dead husband. What are you doing? But then I'd think about those 5 words. Don't board that flight. And I would think about the other 5 words. I have preparations to complete. And I would understand, in whatever way one understands things before one fully understands them, that I was not making a mistake. I was arriving somewhere. Something David had built was receiving me. I stepped off Walnut Street and pushed open the door of Leone's, and the warmth came out to meet me, and I thought, he was here. He chose this place. He sat in this warmth and planned what would happen next. Philadelphia in March is a specific kind of cold. Not brutal like January, but persistent. A damp gray cold that gets into wool and never fully leaves. The walk from the Broad Street line to Walnut Street took me past old row houses with their painted stoops, past the corner flower vendor who was there every morning without fail, past the kind of city block that has existed in some form for 200 years and will exist for 200 more. I'd walked these blocks 1,000 times, with David, without him. I walked them now feeling like I was moving through water. Leone's was warm and smelled of espresso and old wood. Robert Kimura was already there. He was 63, maybe 64, with silver-streaked hair and a dark suit that fit the way expensive suits fit, like it had been made for him specifically. He had the eyes I would later come to think of as investigators' eyes. Quiet, observational, the kind that registered more than they revealed. He stood when he saw me. He shook my hand with both of his. He slid a thumb drive across the table before I'd even fully sat down. Your husband spent $127 dollars on my services over 11 months, he said. He had me investigate his own family, specifically his brother Thomas and sister-in-law Victoria. The names landed like stones dropped into still water, rings spreading out, touching everything. Thomas and Victoria Chen, who had been at the funeral in their good black clothes and their expressions of careful sympathy, who had pushed, within days of the burial, for me to consider selling David's share of Chen Medical Distribution. Thomas, who had produced, at the will reading, in front of the estate attorney and everyone assembled, a handwritten note he claimed was David's promise to give him buyback rights on the company shares. Victoria, who had told the estate lawyer, in a tone that managed to be both dismissive and pitying, that Sarah wouldn't understand the business anyway. And Victoria, who had said something else, at the funeral, while I was still holding tissue from weeping over my husband's casket. You've never really been part of this family, Sarah. You were just David's wife. Don't pretend you understand what he built. I want you to understand what those words felt like. Really understand it. because that sentence, delivered quietly, in the kind of tone that could be mistaken for concern, while my husband lay in a casket 12 feet away, was designed with surgical precision. It was designed to arrive at the one moment when I was most exposed, most raw, most unable to defend myself. It was designed to plant a seed. You are an outsider. You were always an outsider. Everything around you, the company, the family, the legacy, belongs to people with this blood, this name. Not to you. You were just David's wife. I want to tell you what those words did. Over 6 weeks of grief. They were not the kind of words that hurt you once and heal. They were the kind that become load-bearing, that you find yourself testing, returning to, building arguments against at 3 a.m. when the counter-arguments don't come easily. They were the kind that asked a question you didn't want to answer. Is this true? Because here is the thing about grief that no one tells you, or that people tell you and you don't believe until you're in it. Grief makes you permeable. The defenses you normally carry, the self-knowledge, the perspective, the ability to hear someone's cruelty and say, simply, this person is being cruel and it tells me nothing about myself. Those defenses thin out. They wear down under the weight of loss until you're moving through the world without them, and every word that reaches you arrives without filtration. So I had turned those words over and over in the exhausted insomnia of those 6 weeks. You've never really been part of this family. What did that mean? That my 30 years with David were something other than what I'd believed? That the love and the life we'd built together was somehow external to the real family? The business family, the blood family, the family that had an actual stake in what David had spent his life building? That I was, at the end of it, an adjunct, an afterthought? You were just David's wife. Just. That word. The casual diminishment of just. As though being David's wife. Being the person he'd chosen to spend every day with. Being the person he'd loved at 24 and 44 and 54. Being the person he'd trusted completely. Was the least thing I could have been. The most obvious thing. The thing that barely required saying. I had let those words do their work on me. I am not ashamed of that, because grief makes you honest, and that's what happened. But I want you to know what it felt like. I want you to understand what David was undoing when he built what he built. He wasn't only protecting me from Thomas's legal challenge. He was answering Victoria. He was answering her precisely and permanently and in the most complete way a person can answer anything. I had carried those words for 6 weeks like a stone in my chest. Turned them over in dark hours, 3 a.m. when grief sat on my sternum and wouldn't move. I had heard them in Victoria's voice when I looked at my husband's things. When I looked at the company paperwork, I didn't understand. When I looked at Thomas's confident eyes at the will reading and wondered if he was right. If I was, in fact, just a widow who didn't understand what she'd been left. What did you find? I asked Robert. He opened the folder. What followed was the kind of revelation that doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in layers, like sediment, each one pressing down on the ones before it. And by the time you feel the full weight, you've already been buried. Your husband suspected Thomas was planning to contest the will and force a sale of his 40% stake in Chen Medical Distribution. David's stake is worth $8, $3 million at current valuation. Thomas owns 35%. Your father-in-law's estate owns the remaining 25%. If Thomas could acquire David's shares, he'd have controlling interest. Robert's voice was measured, factual, kind in the way that people are kind when they're delivering something terrible and they know it. But it's more than a power grab. David discovered that Thomas has been systematically defrauding the company for 6 years. Ghost accounts, inventory that doesn't exist, billed as real inventory. Approximately $230 million annually routed into offshore accounts. I felt my hands go cold. Why didn't David report him? Because Thomas is smart. The fraud is buried in legitimate transactions with legitimate vendors. David couldn't prove it alone. He needed time to build an ironclad case. Robert paused. Time he didn't have. 3 weeks after David's diagnosis, Thomas filed preliminary paperwork to challenge the validity of David's last will. He hired Gerard Morrison, the most aggressive estate litigation attorney in Pennsylvania. The room was warm, my hands were cold. I thought about David, in January of last year, sitting across from an oncologist who was explaining what stage 4 pancreatic cancer meant. And then, 3 weeks later, opening a legal document from his brother. 14 months he'd been fighting 2 wars at once. One he couldn't win. One he refused to lose. On what basis? I asked. Thomas claimed David was mentally incompetent during his cancer treatment, that you manipulated a sick man into leaving everything to you instead of keeping it in the family business. That's insane. I know. David knew it too, and he knew Thomas would do it. That's why he didn't spend his last year at peace, Sarah. He spent it building something. Robert leaned forward, and something shifted in his voice. Not unprofessional, but human. Something underneath the careful tone. Your husband didn't just leave you money. He left you an entire infrastructure designed to protect you and to destroy anyone who came after what he built. I sat across from Robert Kimura in that warm cafe and I thought about the man I'd married. About 24-year-old David, with his crooked smile and his terrible haircut and the way he'd looked at me across a room at a party in 1994, and I'd thought, oh, that was all. Just, oh. The simple recognition of something that mattered. 30 years of 30 years of choosing. 30 years of Sunday mornings with coffee and the crooked bookshelf we'd never fixed, and the dinner parties and the difficult years and the comfortable years, and the years so happy they'd barely had a shape, just a quality. Like light. And at the end of all of it, when the worst thing that could happen had happened, David had not been broken by it. He had not retreated into the understandable privacy of his own fear. He had turned toward me. One last time, turning toward me, doing what he'd done for 30 years, thinking about what I needed. I want you to understand what that is to sit with. Then Robert told me the scope of it. He told me. And I sat in that warm cafe in Center City, Philadelphia and listened. And the world I'd understood for the past 6 weeks, the world where David was simply gone, and I was simply alone, and the future was simply uncertain. That world quietly dissolved. In its place was this. My husband, knowing he had 8 to 12 months, had worked as hard as he'd ever worked at anything in his life. Not on treatments, not on comfort, not on acceptance. On me. On protecting me. On building, with the time and clarity he had left, something that would stand between me and every bad thing that might come after. He had hired 3 different law firms, one specializing in estate defense, one in corporate law, one in criminal referrals if the evidence warranted it. Combined retainers, $185,000. He had worked with a forensic accountant named Dr. James Patterson over 9 months, methodically documenting every fraudulent transaction Thomas had made since 2018. The resulting report was 847 pages. The evidence had been stored in 7 different locations: a bank vault downtown, the offices of 3 separate attorneys, a safety deposit box in Marcus's name, a digital archive in a cloud server with dual-key encryption, and a physical copy at Robert's office. Thomas would have had to rob 7 different locations simultaneously to destroy it. He had recorded 14 video depositions while still healthy, while he still looked like himself, while his voice was still strong, while no one watching them could say this was a man diminished by illness. Each video was time-stamped. Each video was witnessed by 2 attorneys and a notary. Each video had been stored separately, with different lawyers, so that no single legal threat could suppress them all. He had restructured his 40% ownership stake in Chen Medical Distribution into a specific type of trust, carefully designed so that I controlled the shares absolutely, could not be compelled to sell under any litigation pressure, and any hostile acquisition would require my explicit written consent, consent I was legally permitted to withhold indefinitely. He had obtained 6 separate written valuations of the company from different business brokers, establishing that his $8, $3 million estimate was, if anything, conservative. The company was worth closer to $11 million at full value. This was important, Robert explained, because it demonstrated not just that David's estate was substantial, but that Thomas's motive for fraud was overwhelming. With documentation. I will tell you what it was like to hear each of these things in sequence. The law firms, the forensic accountant, the trust structure, the 14 video depositions. Each one arrived like a wave, and each wave was followed immediately by another. I didn't have time to fully absorb one revelation before the next was upon me. What I retained in the moment was not the specifics. Those I would go over many times in the following days, methodically with Linda's help. But the cumulative effect of the specifics, the sense of scale, the understanding of what 11 months of deliberate, dying man effort actually looked like when laid out end to end. He had been exhausted, those 14 months. And in the last 11, he had been doing all of this. Meeting with Robert, meeting with Linda and Dr. Patterson, reviewing documents, recording videos, restructuring trusts, researching corporate law, looking across the dinner table at me and saying I love you, and then, after I'd gone to sleep, getting back to work. I was 52 years old, and I understood, for the first time, what I had meant to someone. And then there was the flight. I'd almost forgotten about the flight, in the avalanche of everything else. But Robert hadn't. He pulled out his phone. He showed me a news alert, time-stamped 2 hours earlier. Air Canada flight AC-8847 had made an emergency landing in Calgary, Alberta, due to severe mechanical failure. Catastrophic engine malfunction over the Rockies. 37 injuries reported, 12 of them serious. The terminal I would have been sitting in, the seat I would have been in, somewhere over those mountains. Sarah, Robert said quietly. David didn't know the plane would have problems. He couldn't have known. But he knew that specific aircraft model had been experiencing maintenance issues. He'd researched it, because of course he had, because he'd researched everything. And he knew the statistical probability of a serious incident on that route, in that time frame, was elevated. He left instructions. If any concerning maintenance reports appeared for that specific flight in the week before your departure, I was to contact you immediately. He told me to use your son's name because he knew. He said you'd trust Marcus before you'd trust a stranger. I could not speak. He was calculating contingencies, Robert continued, from 14 months in the future. He was trying to anticipate every possible way Thomas could be helped by your absence. If you'd been injured, or worse, during an active estate litigation, Thomas's argument that the will should revert to blood family would have been significantly stronger. David thought of that. He thought of everything. My husband had sent me a text message from beyond death. He had stopped me from boarding a plane that had just made an emergency landing in the Canadian Rockies. He had saved my life from 11 months in the future, from a hospital bed where he was supposed to be thinking about himself, from a world he would never see. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't find the floor. 2 people approached the table. Sarah, Robert said, this is Linda Zhao, your husband's corporate attorney. Linda Zhao was 40-something, dressed in the kind of suit that says, I win cases, with the eyes to match. She sat down and opened her briefcase and wasted exactly 0 seconds. And Dr. James Patterson, Robert continued, the forensic accountant. Dr. Patterson was older, methodical, with the patient demeanor of someone who spent his professional life finding things people tried to hide. I retained David 9 months ago, Linda said. We've been preparing for Thomas's challenge since June. When he files formally, we'll be ready. David assembled a team, Robert said. Each of us has different pieces. We've been meeting monthly for the better part of a year, coordinating, preparing. And Sarah, he left specific instructions. We only activate if Thomas forces a legal battle. If he accepts the will and backs off, the fraud documentation never becomes public. David wanted to protect the family name if possible. He still thought of Thomas's children, even then. But if Thomas fights, Linda said. And there was a quality to her voice I'd recognize later as the particular satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say exactly this: "We bury him." David made that very clear. Thomas had filed his formal will challenge the previous day. The hearing was 2 weeks away. Those 14 days, the 2 weeks between learning everything and walking into Judge Woodson's courtroom, were the strangest weeks of my life. And I've had some strange ones. But these had a quality unlike anything I'd experienced before. The quality of finally having something to do with grief. Let me explain what I mean by that. For 6 weeks before Robert's call, grief had been entirely passive. Something that happened to you. Something you absorbed. You woke up, and it was there. You went through the day, and it was with you. You made phone calls to estate attorneys and answered well-intentioned messages from people you loved and put away the shaving cream and did all the functional things that a person does when a person is gone. And you did all of them inside the grief, the way you carry an injury everywhere. It doesn't stop you from moving, but it colors everything. And then Robert sat across a table from me and the grief had somewhere to go. I met with Linda Zhao for 3 hours the first morning. Her office was on the 32nd floor of a building on Broad Street, with a view of the city that David had described, I would later learn, as suitable for making decisions. He had specifically told her, "Meet Sarah here. Don't meet in a conference room. I want her to see the city." She had the 847-page forensic accounting report on the table. We did not read it page by page. I am not a forensic accountant. And Linda was precise about what she needed me to understand versus what she was handling. But she walked me through its structure. The shell vendors Thomas had created, the patterns of the invoicing, the routing of funds. Dr. Patterson had constructed the narrative of Thomas's fraud the way a novelist constructs a plot. Not just a list of crimes, but a story of how it had been done, and why it had worked, and why it had been so difficult to detect without David's inside knowledge of the company's legitimate operations. Thomas was smart, Linda confirmed, not brilliant. She said this with a brief, dry efficiency that told me everything about her assessment of his intellect, but methodical. He had structured the fraud to blend into the noise of a mid-sized distribution company, where millions of small transactions make individual anomalies difficult to isolate. Without David's pattern recognition, built over 20 years of running the business, it might never have been found. But David had found it. And more. He'd had to figure out how to document it without tipping Thomas off. Any internal investigation would have alerted Thomas. Any direct confrontation before the documentation was complete would have given him time to erase his tracks. David had spent the first several months of his investigation, months when he was also managing chemotherapy and business operations, and a family who thought he was simply unusually tired, building the case in complete secrecy. Linda told me this without editorializing. She presented it the way she presented all the facts, clearly, precisely, with the efficiency of someone whose job is to win arguments rather than win sympathies. But at one point, she stopped and looked at me over the table and said, "Your husband was one of the most disciplined people I've ever worked with, under conditions that would have broken most people. I wanted you to know that." I didn't speak for a moment. Then I asked her, "Did he ever tell you how he was feeling?" "Not about the case. About everything else?" She was quiet for a few seconds. "He told me once," she said, "that he wasn't afraid of being gone, that his only fear was leaving you unprotected. He used the word specifically." She paused again. "Unprotected. He said he could bear the other things, but not that." I called Marcus and Jessica that evening. Marcus had known about the investigation. He was the reason I'd gotten Robert's text, since David had stored some of the critical documents in a safety deposit box in Marcus's name and had prepared him, over several months of carefully managed conversations, for the possibility that he might need to act. But Marcus hadn't known the full scope, and hearing it, he was very quiet for a long time on the phone. He said, "Dad told me it was handled." That's all he said. He said, "Things are handled for your mother." I didn't push. His voice when he said it. There was something in it I recognized. The particular sound of grief that has found a new channel. Not less painful, but differently shaped. A grief that now contained not only loss, but something like wonder. Jessica's reaction was different. Immediate and fierce. She wanted to know if Thomas could go to prison. She wanted to know if there was something she could do to help. She was 25 and burning with a clean, uncomplicated rage that I found unexpectedly comforting. She did not have the ambivalence about Thomas and Victoria that I had, the years of family dinners, the children's birthday parties, the 26 years of accumulated ordinary proximity that made it hard to see them only as the villains they had apparently been all along. Jessica saw it clearly, and her clarity was like a window in a room that had been too long without air. I met with Robert twice more in those 2 weeks. We went over the timeline of the fraud. We discussed what would happen at the hearing. He explained the specific security he'd put in place to ensure the evidence remained safe until it was presented in court. He explained David's specific instruction about the 7 storage locations, the way he'd distributed the evidence not just for security, but for psychological effect. When Thomas learned what existed, Robert told me, David wanted him to understand that there was no single point of failure, no vulnerability, no version of events in which he could make it go away. He was right, Robert said. When Morrison requested preliminary discovery and got even a partial picture of what we had assembled, he attempted to negotiate a settlement immediately. Linda didn't take the call. I spent time in those 2 weeks sitting with the 14 videos. Linda had given me copies. I watched some of them alone, late at night, in the living room with the lamp behind me. The same lamp that appeared in the last video, the one he'd recorded at home. Some of them were strictly deposition footage, careful, legalistic, made for court. But in several of them, the later ones, made when he was clearly less well, when he couldn't quite hide all of the exhaustion, he would look directly at the camera at the end and say something outside the formal record. In October, 3 weeks before he died, he'd recorded the last one, the one Linda was saving for after. I didn't watch that one yet. I knew what it was for. I waited, but I watched the others. And I understood, watching them, what those months must have been. The careful performance of normalcy for my benefit. The work sessions after I'd gone to sleep. The weight he'd been carrying alone, which he had chosen to carry alone, because he had decided that the greatest gift he could give me was those 14 months. Those ordinary months. The last ordinary months, which I had lived in fully, without shadow, because he had stood between me and the shadow. I want to tell you what those 2 weeks felt like, because they matter. They're not a footnote in this story. They're the space in which I changed. The 2 weeks between learning the truth and walking into that courtroom were the weeks I stopped being the woman Victoria thought she had dismissed at a funeral, stopped being a widow who didn't understand what she'd been left, stopped hearing those words and feeling their sting and wondering, in the small hours, if they were true. Because here is what I understood, slowly, sitting with Robert and Linda and Dr. Patterson and the 847 pages of documentation and the 14 video depositions and the 7 storage locations and the $185. in retainers and the text message sent by a man who had already died. I understood that David had been watching me. For 30 years, he'd been watching me. And what he saw was not what Victoria saw. What he saw was someone worth building a fortress for. Someone worth spending the last functional year of his life protecting. Someone worth more to him than peace or comfort or acceptance or any of the other things a dying man might reasonably want to spend his remaining energy on. "You were just David's wife," Victoria had said. And standing on the other side of those 2 weeks, with Linda's briefcase full of ironclad evidence, and David's voice preserved on 14 different videos and a forensic accounting report that would make a federal prosecutor's career, I thought, yes, I was David's wife. And you have no idea what that meant to him. I still heard it. I won't pretend I didn't. In the car, in the mornings, in the silences. You've never really been part of this family. You were just David's wife. Don't pretend you understand what he built. But now I knew what he'd built. I had 847 pages of evidence about what he'd built. And I understood finally that Victoria had been more right than she knew. Just not in the way she'd intended. I didn't understand what he built. Nobody did. Not fully. Not until now. Judge Margaret Woodson's courtroom in Philadelphia County Court was everything you'd imagine from a century-old courthouse. Dark wood paneling, marble floors worn smooth by 100 years of the weight of consequence. High ceilings that turned voices into something slightly formal, slightly larger than life. It was a room designed to remind you that whatever you were deciding here mattered. That it would be recorded. That it would not be undone easily. Thomas sat with Gerard Morrison at the plaintiff's table. Morrison was everything Robert had described. Sharp, polished, the kind of attorney who wore confidence like a weapon. Thomas himself looked the way he always looked, assured, slightly above the proceedings, the expression of a man who had already decided how this ended. Victoria was in the gallery, dressed beautifully, expensively, in the way that said she had dressed for an occasion she expected to enjoy. Her expression was the one I knew from the funeral, from the will reading, the expression of someone observing something that was, at most, a mild inconvenience. I sat with Linda Zhao and felt my own heartbeat in my throat. Morrison presented his case. David Chen had been mentally compromised by his illness and his treatment. He had made irrational, impulsive decisions under the influence of medications and the psychological distress of a terminal diagnosis. The will, updated 18 months before his death, did not reflect David's true wishes, but rather the manipulative influence of a wife who stood to benefit enormously from its provisions. The court should invalidate it and revert to the 2019 version, which had reflected a more equitable distribution between immediate family and business interests. Morrison was good. He was very good. He had the vocabulary of someone who had done this many times. The smooth medical language about cognitive impairment, the careful implication of undue influence without ever quite saying manipulation, the well-practiced concern for the integrity of the deceased's true wishes. If I hadn't known what was coming, it might have worked on me. Linda Zhao stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to present 14 video depositions made by David Chen between January and October of last year, each establishing his complete mental competency and explicitly stating his testamentary intentions." Morrison objected on grounds of relevance. The judge overruled. The first video began. I was watching Thomas's face. I know that sounds strange, that in a room where my husband's face was appearing on a screen for the first time since his death, I was watching his brother. But I had spent years watching David, and I would have the rest of my life to watch these videos again alone. In this room, in this moment, what mattered was the effect. What mattered was whether everything David had built was going to work. Thomas was looking at the screen too. Of course he was. You can't not look. But there was something in the set of his jaw, something carefully controlled. The expression of a man who is trying very hard to appear unmoved by something that is, in fact, moving him significantly. I recognized that expression. I'd seen it at the will reading when the estate attorney had begun reading the trust provisions aloud. That quality of effort, that concentration required to hold a face still. Morrison had papers in front of him. He was looking at them. I don't know what papers they were. but the act of looking at them rather than the screen told me something. The room was absolutely quiet when David's face appeared on screen. I hadn't been prepared for that. I thought I'd been thinking about it for 2 weeks, had known what was coming. But there is nothing that prepares you for your husband's face on a screen in a courtroom, 3 months after his death, looking at you, looking through the camera at a future he was designing. He looked thin. He had looked thin by March of last year, thin in a way he'd started explaining as stress, as work, as not sleeping well. I believed him. I thought about that I'd believed him, that I'd watched him look thinner and more tired across 14 months and believed every explanation he gave, and something in my chest pulled tight. But his eyes were exactly the same, clear, direct, absolutely present. "I am David Chen," he said, and his voice filled that old courtroom like it belonged there. "Today is March 15th of last year. I am of sound mind. I am making this statement to establish my intentions for my estate, because I do not trust my brother Thomas to honor my wishes after my death." Linda had prepared me for the videos, but not fully for what it would feel like to hear his voice in a room full of strangers who had not loved him. There is an intimacy to hearing a dead person's voice that cannot be prepared for. Each word arrived as itself, and also as everything else. As the particular way he always said my name, as the years of conversations over dinner and in the car and in the quiet dark before sleep, as the whole accumulated vocabulary of 30 years shared with another person. But what I remember most clearly is this: he was not performing. On the screen, in that courtroom, what David presented was simply himself, his actual mind, working at full capacity, laying out exactly what he wanted and exactly why he wanted it. There was no melodrama, no appeal for sympathy. A dying man making his case with the precision and confidence of someone who knew he was right and needed only to ensure that the record reflected it clearly. Judge Woodson had a notepad. I watched her write something as the video played. Whatever it was, she wrote it carefully, and she underlined it twice. He then, for the next 11 minutes, laid out his testamentary intentions with the precision of someone who had spent months organizing his thoughts. Every clause of his will, every reason for every decision, the trust structure for his company shares, and why. The provisions for Marcus and Jessica, and why. The estate plan that prioritized Sarah, his wife, his partner, the person who had been the actual architecture of his daily life for 30 years, and exactly why. He spoke about Thomas. He spoke carefully but without cruelty, with the particular restraint of a man who had thought deeply about how to be honest without being vindictive, and had concluded that accuracy was kinder than either. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If my brother claims I was not of sound mind when I made these decisions, I want the court to consider this. I knew I was dying. I had 8 months, perhaps, and in those 8 months, I chose to spend my remaining clarity on making sure my wife was protected. That is not the decision of an impaired mind. It is the decision of a man who knows exactly what matters." Morrison tried to object again. The judge overruled again, with a quality to her voice that suggested she was not going to do that a third time. 14 videos. They played one after another. Different dates, different lighting, sometimes in Linda's office, sometimes at his desk at home, sometimes I realized in the car, but always the same eyes, always the same clarity, always the same man who had known exactly what he was doing and had taken pains to make sure nobody could pretend otherwise. By the 6th video, Thomas had stopped looking confident. By the 10th, he was very still in the way that people are still when they are trying to contain something that wants to escape. Then Linda called Dr. Patterson to the stand. For 40 minutes, the forensic accountant presented what I would later describe to Robert as a master class in financial consequences. He was methodical, Dr. Patterson, in the way of someone who understood that the most devastating thing he could do was simply be clear. No drama, No accusation, just numbers, and what they meant, and where they went. He had traced every suspicious transaction back to 2018. He had documented the creation of shell vendors, the submission of invoices for inventory that had never been ordered, received, or existed. He had followed the money through 3 layers of financial obfuscation to the offshore accounts where it had landed. He had calculated the total, $1, $4 million over 6 years, stolen from Chen Medical Distribution, stolen from Thomas's own father, from David, from every employee who had built that company with their labor and trusted the people at the top to run it honestly. $230 per year. Every year. While Thomas sat at board meetings and talked about fiscal responsibility, Morrison tried to object on relevance grounds. The judge asked him to explain how evidence of the plaintiff's criminal fraud against the estate in question was irrelevant to a proceeding about that estate's validity. Morrison did not have a good answer. Let me tell you what it looked like at the plaintiff's table in those moments. I don't say this with any satisfaction, or not much, and I'm aware of the ethical complexity of describing the collapse of someone who, whatever his crimes, had children at home, who would live with the consequences of this day. But I'm telling you this story completely, which means I'm telling you what I saw. Morrison was on his feet, and then he was sitting down again, and then he was flipping through papers with a focused intensity that resembled productivity without quite achieving it. The objections had stopped because the objections had not worked. The narrative he had constructed, the manipulative widow, the diminished man, the will that didn't reflect true intentions, was not surviving contact with the man on the screen, who was manifestly not diminished, who was manifestly not confused, who was speaking in the measured voice of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had taken precise steps to ensure that no one, ever, could credibly claim otherwise. Thomas sat beside his attorney with his hands flat on the table. His face had gone somewhere I couldn't entirely read. Not defeat yet, not the formal acknowledgement of defeat, but something that precedes it. The particular stillness of someone watching a future they had considered certain, becoming uncertain, and then impossible. Victoria had left the courtroom by the time Dr. Patterson finished his testimony. I watched her go. That careful, expensive walk, the precise posture, the face that had been so composed when she arrived and was now doing something I could not quite read. Not quite fear, not quite shame. Something in between, something she hadn't expected to feel today, in this room that was supposed to end the way she and Thomas had planned. She walked through those heavy courtroom doors, and they closed behind her, and I thought, quietly, "You've never really been part of this family, Sarah." "Your Honor," Linda said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has been working toward a moment for 9 months and has finally arrived there. "We are not only asking the court to uphold David Chen's will. We are asking you to refer this matter to the U.S. Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." Thomas Chen did not merely contest a will. He committed federal wire fraud and money laundering across 6 years, and he filed this challenge, using the legal system itself as a weapon, while simultaneously stealing from the very estate he was claiming to protect. Judge Woodson looked at Thomas Chen for a long moment. Her expression was the one that judges develop over careers. Not contempt. Exactly, but the particular blankness of someone who has decided what they think and is giving nothing away before they're ready to give it officially. "Mr. Morrison, does your client have any response to the evidence presented by Dr. Patterson?" Morrison said something. I don't remember what exactly. Some legal language, some attempt at deflection, something about admissibility or timing or the burden of proof. It was the sound of someone trying to find solid ground that wasn't there. Thomas said nothing. He had nothing. The 14 videos had made his argument impossible. The 847 pages had made his denial impossible. David had spent 11 months making Thomas's victory impossible. The ruling came within the hour. Will challenge dismissed with prejudice. No basis for a finding of mental incompetence. 14 video depositions establishing the opposite. Thank you. Motion denied. No credible evidence of undue influence. David Chen's estate plan upheld in its entirety. And the court would be referring the evidence of financial fraud to federal prosecutors for their consideration. I sat in that old courtroom and felt something happen in my chest. Not relief, exactly. It wasn't simple enough to be relief. Something more like a settling, like the particular silence after a very long noise finally stops. Like something that has been held taut for 6 weeks, or 14 months, or perhaps 30 years, finding its resting place. Outside the courthouse on the steps, with the March wind coming off the Delaware River and the city doing what cities do all around us, going about its business, indifferent to everything that had just happened, Linda turned to me. "There's one more thing," she said. "David left you a final video. He said to show it to you only after Thomas's challenge was defeated. Are you ready?" I thought I was. I was wrong. But in the best way I've ever been wrong about anything. In Linda's office, half an hour later, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the sounds of Walnut Street drifting up from below, I watched the last message my husband had ever left for me. He had recorded it in our living room. I recognized the lamp behind him. The particular slant of October light through our front windows, the way the old oak bookshelf was slightly crooked on the left side. We'd never fixed it, had always meant to, had always found something else to do. He'd recorded it 2 months before he died. He looked tired in a way the deposition videos hadn't shown. Real exhaustion, the kind he'd been hiding from me, the kind that couldn't be put away on camera when what you were doing was being honest for the last time. But he was smiling. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was my whole chest cracking open, my whole 30 years landing at once, every morning and every evening and every ordinary in between. "Sarah, if you're watching this, it means everything worked. It means Thomas tried to take what I built, and you won. I'm so sorry you had to fight this battle. I'm sorry I couldn't be there for it." He smiled then. That particular crooked smile I had fallen in love with when I was 22 years old, and he was 24, and neither of us knew anything yet. "But I want you to know," he said, "protecting you was the easiest decision I ever made. You gave me 30 years of the happiest life I could have imagined. You loved me when my own family saw me as a business asset. You made our home the only place I ever felt like I could breathe. I let the tears come. There was no one to perform composure for. I spent my last good year making sure they couldn't hurt you. And I need you to know, it wasn't a burden. It was a gift. I got to love you one last time, in the only way I had left." He looked at the camera, at me, across all those months, through the impossible distance. "Thomas will face justice now. The company is yours. Do with it whatever brings you peace. Sell it, run it, burn it down. I don't care. I only care that you're safe and free." He paused. "And Sarah? Don't mourn too long. I'm not there anymore. I'm wherever you are when you laugh, when you watch the sunrise, when you finally take that trip to Victoria Island that I ruined with my paranoia about plane safety." He laughed. My husband laughed, on that screen, from October, from forever, and it was the most beautiful thing I had heard in months. "I love you," he said. "I loved you. I will always have loved you. Everything I built was for you. Everything I protected was for you. You were the only thing that ever mattered." The video ended. There were tissues on the table, as I said. I used many of them. At some point, the afternoon light shifted, and the quality of the sounds from Walnut Street below changed. The end of business day energy coming into it, the city gearing up for evening, all of it proceeding without pause, as it always does. As it had when David died and when I'd missed my flight and when the hearing had ended 2 hours ago. And I found eventually that the crying had changed. There is a kind of crying that is pure loss, the sharp physical grief of the early weeks when the absence arrives fresh each time. when the body is still learning the shape of what is gone. And there is another kind, quieter, that comes from sitting with something enormous and letting it fully land. This was the second kind, the slow kind, the kind that has time in it. I thought about the lamp behind him, the crooked bookshelf, the October light through our front windows that I knew so well I could describe it from any season, in any year, going back to the first autumn we'd lived in that house. 22 years we had lived there. Marcus had been 6, Jessica had been 3. We had painted the kitchen a color called morning fog and decided within a week we hated it, and repainted it cream. The ceiling in the master bedroom was 2 inches lower than code required, and David had nearly hit it once when he stood up too fast on the bed, and we had laughed until we couldn't breathe, and it had become one of our stories, the kind that no one outside a marriage understands completely. He had recorded that video in our living room. He had sat down in the chair by the lamp, and he had looked into a camera and spoken to me across the distance of months and death and loss, and he had been smiling. I will always have loved you. Not, I love you, and now I'm gone. Not, I loved you once, and the love is finished. I will always have loved you. Present perfect tense turned future. The grammar of something that persists in time regardless of whether the person persisting is still here to feel it. I thought about grammar, and I thought about the crooked bookshelf, and I thought about 30 years, and I let it land completely. Every bit of it. And when Linda knocked softly and opened the door to ask if I needed anything, I looked at her and said, I need to thank you. And she sat down and we didn't say very much for a while, which was exactly right. I stayed in Linda's office for a long time. Long enough for the afternoon light to shift and the street noise to change, and for Linda to quietly leave a box of tissues on the table and close the door gently behind her. Long enough to cry in the way you cry when grief and gratitude arrive at the same moment, and you can't separate them. When the loss and the love are so completely intertwined that feeling one means feeling the other, fully, without reservation. He had loved me so much that dying hadn't stopped him. He had loved me so much that he'd turned his final year into a construction project, built me a fortress, hired me an army, documented the truth so thoroughly that no lie could survive contact with it. He had saved my life from a plane over the Rockies. He had defeated his brother's fraud in a federal courtroom. He had found a way to hold my hand through a legal battle he never lived to see. You've never really been part of this family, Victoria had said. David had spent 11 months and $127,000 and every remaining ounce of his energy proving otherwise. 3 weeks after the hearing, federal prosecutors indicted Thomas Chen on 14 counts of wire fraud and money laundering. The evidence was, as Dr. Patterson had promised, irrefutable. Thomas took a plea deal. 7 years in federal prison, full restitution of the $1, $4 million he'd stolen, and a permanent ban from serving as an officer or director of any corporation. 7 years. For stealing from his own father. For stealing from his dying brother. For trying to steal from a widow in a courtroom while she grieved. Victoria filed for divorce within a month of the indictment. Whatever calculation she had made when she married Thomas, whatever she had weighed and found acceptable, the math had changed. I thought about Victoria a great deal in those months, not with hatred. I had thought I might feel hatred, and instead felt something more complicated, something closer to pity, though not the condescending variety. I thought about what kind of calculation she had made, whether she had known about the fraud, or only suspected, or chosen not to look. Whether she had constructed for herself a version of events in which she was not complicit, in which she had married a man who had simply made some business decisions she was not responsible for. Whether she had believed, right up until Dr. Patterson's testimony, that Thomas's position was defensible, that the widow and her lawyers were a manageable obstacle. I thought about what it would be like to have said those words at a funeral, and then be proven wrong in the most complete way possible. To have said, "You were just David's wife," and then watch the full inventory of what David had built for that wife become the mechanism of your husband's destruction. The irony of it was the particular kind you don't enjoy, even when it's working in your favor. What I kept returning to, in those months, was not anger. It was something more like grief, actually, for a family that had been, for a time, real. The holiday dinners before things were complicated, the summers at the shore when Marcus and Thomas's older son had been inseparable, one summer, running up and down the beach like the world belonged to them. The version of us that might have existed if Thomas had been the person David had believed he was, or had wanted him to be. David had thought of Thomas's children, even then, even as he built the case that would send their father to prison. That is not the behavior of a man who simply wanted to win. That is the behavior of a man who was grieving his brother while he destroyed him. I think about that a great deal. But David hadn't finished. Even then, even in the resolution, there was one more layer. Buried in the forensic accounting report, a clause Dr. Patterson explained had been David's specific instruction, was a provision that in the event of Thomas's criminal conviction, his 35% ownership stake in Chen Medical Distribution would be liquidated to cover restitution and legal fees. And David had prearranged a specific buyer for those shares, a cooperative formed by the company's longtime employees. People who had worked at Chen Medical Distribution for decades. People who had built it, year by year, with their labor and their expertise and their loyalty to an institution that Thomas had been quietly robbing the entire time. Thomas's shares went to the people he'd exploited. At fair market value, not a penny less. David had been scrupulously fair, even in justice. But to them, the employees became partial owners of the company they'd built. My father-in-law's estate, deeply shaken by the revelations about Thomas, sold its 25% to the cooperative as well. Chen Medical Distribution became employee-owned. I kept my 40%, but gave operational control to the people who had actually run the business for decades, who knew every client and every supply chain and every relationship that made the thing work. I kept the stake because David had wanted me to, because it was mine, and I had earned it by being his partner for 30 years. But I was not the right person to run a pharmaceutical distribution company. The right people were already there. Thomas had schemed for controlling interest in a company. He had ended up in federal prison while the people he'd treated as disposable assets ran the empire he'd tried to steal. David had called it, in his notes, posthumous justice. I called it something else. Something I'd learned from 30 years with a man who believed that the most powerful thing in the world was preparation applied to love. 6 months after the trial, I took the trip. Not to Vancouver. I thought I'd probably never book Air Canada again, which I mentioned to Robert and made him laugh for a long time, but to Victoria Island, like David had originally wanted. By ferry from Victoria, British Columbia, in the golden particular light of early September. Linda came. Robert came, because it turned out that a year of working together on something this significant had made us into something I didn't have a precise word for. Not quite friends yet, but close to it. The kind of close that comes from shared stakes and shared grief and shared victory. Dr. Patterson came too, because he had, as Robert put it, earned it. Victoria Island in September was everything David had promised. I had spent 30 years hearing about this place. David had grown up reading about the Canadian Pacific coast and had developed, in the way of people who love geography, a particular attachment to places he'd never been. An attachment built out of books and photographs and the accounts of other people, so that when you finally arrived, there was both discovery and recognition. He had described the light to me many times, the old-growth forest smell, the way the ocean looked from the western shore at evening. I had agreed to go, 30 years of agreeing, and something had always come up. Work, children, parents' weekends at Berkeley, the particular accumulation of reasons that makes years pass without the things you intend to do ever quite getting done. We had been very good, David and I, at most things. We had not been good at Victoria Island. And now I was here. There is something that happens when you experience a place someone loved but never lived to see. A doubling. the beauty of the place itself, which is real, which was everything he'd promised. The Pacific light improbable and golden, the forests impossibly green against the gray blue of the water, and the beauty of the fact that he had wanted this for me. That among the 11 months of legal preparation and evidence gathering and careful architecture for my protection, he had also simply wanted me to stand somewhere beautiful, had wanted me to feel the salt wind off the Pacific and look at old-growth trees and be somewhere other than inside the grief. He had given me a lot of things: the company, the justice, the fortress. But he'd also given me this: permission to go somewhere new. Permission to find the world still beautiful. Permission to breathe free. I breathed free. For him. For myself. For both. The Pacific light. The old-growth forests coming almost to the shoreline. The particular quality of silence that you only get when you're standing at the edge of something vast. We had rented a small house near the water. We cooked dinner together the first night and told stories and laughed about things that had been too serious to laugh at when they were happening. On the second evening, we walked down to the beach to watch the sun go down over the Pacific. The sky turned orange and then gold and then a pink that had no name I knew. We stood in a loose cluster, the four of us, holding wine glasses and feeling the wind, and Linda raised her glass. "To David Chen," she said. Paranoid, brilliant, loving son of a bitch. I laughed. I cried at the same time. I was getting good at both at once. "To David," I said. Robert was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard from him before. Something past professional. Something personal. "I worked for a lot of clients over 40 years, he said. Never met one who loved like that. Who turned dying into an act of protection." We were all quiet for a moment after Robert said that. The four of us, standing in the Pacific wind with our wine glasses, feeling the weight of it. There is a specific kind of silence that forms around something true, around a statement that contains more than a sentence should be able to hold. And this was that. I didn't want to fill it immediately. Linda looked out at the water. Dr. Patterson, who was not a man of many emotional words, turned his wine glass slowly in his hands in a gesture I'd come to associate with his deepest thinking. Robert was looking at me with his investigator's eyes, which had stopped being unreadable to me over the past months. What I saw in them now was something genuine. Something that I thought might be simply the satisfaction of a person who had helped do something he was proud of. I thought about what David had said in his notes. In the private notes that had been included in the sealed documents Robert had kept for me. The ones that were meant for me alone, and not for any court. He had written, "I want her surrounded by people who know the truth. Not just the legal truth, the full truth. Make sure she's not alone with any of this. She's not alone with any of this." Robert said, "He chose well." He meant me, I think. Or maybe the team. Or maybe all of us. Choosing each other, the way David had arranged. I think he was right. I thought about that. About what it meant to turn dying into an act of protection. What it required. The deliberate choice to spend the diminishing resource of your healthy days, not on peace, not on acceptance, not on yourself, but on someone else. On making sure they would be safe in a future you couldn't enter. "He texted me from the grave," I said. And I was still a little amazed by it. Still would be, I thought, for the rest of my life. He stopped me from boarding a plane. He built me an army. He destroyed his own brother to keep me safe. "He loved you," Linda said. Simply. Completely. That's what love looks like when you can't stay. And standing there, on Victoria Island, watching the light David had wanted me to see turn the Pacific into something extraordinary. I understood it. The whole shape of it. He hadn't left me money. He'd left me proof. Proof that love, when it is serious enough and deliberate enough and willing enough to pay every cost, does not end when the body does. That protection can outlast breath. That someone who loves you enough will find every possible way to hold you safe, even from the other side of an impossible distance. I pulled out my phone. I looked at the text message one more time. The unknown number. The 5 words. Don't board that flight. Trust me. The last time David Chen saved my life. I held it for a long moment, that message. The way you hold something you know you're about to let go of. Feeling the weight. Saying goodbye to the object so you can keep the meaning. Then I deleted it. The sky was gold over the Pacific. The wind was cold and clean. 3 people who had become family through battle were standing beside me, and somewhere in the preparation and the justice and the love so fierce it outlasted death, somewhere in all of it, my husband was present. Not in the text. Not in the case files. Not in the videos, though I would watch them again. In the space that opened up when I breathed freely. In the knowledge that I had been loved so completely that someone had spent his last good year making sure I knew it. I didn't need the text anymore. I could feel him every time I breathed free. There is a research concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. The idea that certain kinds of loss and struggle, when processed fully, don't only leave wounds. They leave an expanded capacity for understanding, for depth, for seeing things that were invisible before the difficulty came. I think about that when I think about David, and when I think about the specific kind of love he demonstrated. Not romantic love in the abstract, but love made concrete, love made plans, love made 14 video depositions and 847 pages of evidence and a text message on a timer. I think about what it actually means to love someone with intention. Research consistently shows that people underestimate how much their deliberate, planned actions communicate love compared to spontaneous gestures. We remember the grand moment, the surprise, the passion of the unexpected. But what psychologists find, when they study long-term bonds, real ones, durable ones, is that the love that lasts is the love that plans, that prepares, that says, I'm thinking about you not just right now, but in every future I can imagine, including the ones where I'm no longer in them. David had known he was leaving. He had spent 11 months not denying that, not bargaining with it, but working with it, using the knowledge of his absence as a design parameter, building something that would function without him. That is not what grief looks like from the outside. It looks from the outside like paperwork, like legal fees and retainers and forensic accounting. But from the inside, from where I stood on a beach in September, feeling his love in the wind and the work and the justice and the people around me, it was the most romantic thing I have ever experienced. The most complete expression of 30 years of being truly seen and truly loved that I could imagine. Love doesn't end when the body does. Sometimes, when it's been built carefully enough, it persists. It protects. It reaches across impossible distances and stops you from boarding the wrong flight, and makes sure the people who tried to diminish you are held accountable for every word. Don't mourn too long, he said. I'm wherever you are when you breathe free. I've been practicing that. In the months since Victoria Island, I have been practicing it consciously. The way you practice a physical skill, with repetition, knowing that understanding is not the same as mastery, and that mastery comes only through repeated return. Some days I am better at it than others. There are mornings when the grief is present in the old way, the heavy way, when the crooked bookshelf and the empty side of the medicine cabinet and the particular silences of a house built for 2 are louder than everything else. Those mornings exist and will continue to exist, and I am not trying to pretend otherwise. But there are also mornings when I make my own coffee. I haven't stopped making 2 cups, actually. I have not quite gotten there yet. And carry it to the front window and watch the light come up over the neighborhood, the old row houses with their painted stoops, the corner flower vendor, the city beginning its 200th and something year of existing without much concern for any particular person's grief or joy. And I think, I am here. He made it possible for me to be here, safely and freely and with the whole truth in my hands. and I breathe. There's something in that breath. Something that's his. I'm still learning that. Still practicing it. But I'm learning. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of what I felt sitting in Linda's office watching that final video, hit the like button right now, because that small action tells this channel to keep finding and sharing stories like this one. Leave a comment below and tell me, what part of David's plan stunned you most? Was it the text from the grave? The 14 videos? The fact that he turned his dying year into a fortress? I genuinely want to know, because every single comment is a conversation I get to have with someone who cared enough to stay until the end. Subscribe if you haven't yet. It's free, and it means you won't miss what's coming next. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love knowing that stories like this one are reaching people I'll never meet, in places I've never been, at 3 in the morning or on a lunch break or in the quiet after the kids go to sleep. Because the video coming up next, the one already on your screen, it starts where this one ends. Another ordinary person, another extraordinary choice. Another story that will make you reconsider what love, at its deepest and most deliberate, is actually capable of. Don't close this window. You're going to want to see what happens next.